The story of the House of Valois is one of the most dramatic chapters in all of European history. For 261 years, this remarkable dynasty ruled France through some of the most turbulent, transformative, and consequential periods the Western world has ever witnessed. They inherited a kingdom on the brink of catastrophe, and through generations of war, plague, madness, and civil strife, they not only preserved France but transformed it into the most powerful nation in Europe. Theirs is a tale of survival against impossible odds, of brilliant kings and disastrous ones, of saints and sinners, of battles won and lost, and ultimately of a dynasty that shaped the very foundations of the modern French state before disappearing into the mists of history. To understand the House of Valois, we must first travel back to the early 14th century, to a France that looked remarkably different from the nation we know today. The kingdom had been ruled for over 300 years by the Capetian dynasty, a family that had taken the throne in 987 when Hugh Capet was elected king by the great nobles of France. Through careful marriage alliances, fortunate births of male heirs, and shrewd political manoeuvring, the Capetians had built France into the most populous and prosperous kingdom in Western Christendom. The 13th century had been a golden age for Capetian France. Under kings like Philip II, known as Augustus, Louis the Ninth, who would be canonized as Saint Louis, and Philip IV, called the Fair, the kingdom had expanded dramatically. The great fiefs that had once made the king merely first among equals were being slowly absorbed into the royal domain. The machinery of royal government grew more sophisticated with each passing generation. Paris emerged as the intellectual and cultural capital of Europe, home to the great university that drew scholars from across the Christian world. Philip IV, who reigned from 1285 to 1314, represented the pinnacle of Capetian power. This cold, calculating monarch had humiliated the papacy, destroyed the Knights Templar, and expanded royal authority to unprecedented heights. He was blessed with 3 sons who survived to adulthood, seemingly guaranteeing the continuation of the direct Capetian line for generations to come. Yet fate had other plans for France, and the seeds of the Valois succession were already being planted in ways that no one at the time could have anticipated. Philip the Fair's 3 sons each ruled in turn, but their reigns were brief, and more importantly, they failed to produce surviving male heirs. Louis X, called the Quarrelsome, reigned for less than 2 years before dying in 1316. He left behind a pregnant wife, and when she gave birth to a son, the infant John I became King of France. But the child lived only 5 days, the shortest reign in French history, and the crown passed to Louis's brother Philip. Philip V, known as the Tall, ruled for 6 years but produced only daughters. When he died in 1322, the crown passed to the youngest of Philip the Fair's sons, Charles IV. Charles, called the Fair like his father, also reigned for 6 years and also failed to produce a surviving son. When Charles died in February 1328, the direct male line of the Capetian dynasty came to an end after 341 years of unbroken succession. The question of who should inherit the French crown in 1328 would shape European history for the next century and beyond. There were 2 principal claimants, and the choice between them would determine not only the future of France, but would ignite one of the longest and most destructive conflicts in medieval history. The first claimant was Edward III, King of England. Edward was the son of Isabella of France, who was herself the daughter of Philip the Fair. Through his mother, Edward was the grandson of a French king and the nephew of the last 3 Capetian monarchs. By the standards of simple proximity of blood, Edward had a strong claim indeed. He was the closest living male relative to the deceased Charles IV, separated by only 1 generation through his mother. The second claimant was Philip of Valois, a French nobleman who was the son of Charles of Valois, who was himself the younger brother of Philip the Fair. Philip of Valois was therefore the first cousin of the last three Capetian kings, separated by 2 generations from Philip the Fair rather than one. By simple genealogical reckoning, his claim appeared weaker than Edward's. But the French nobility had no intention of placing an English king on the throne of France. They invoked an ancient Frankish law code called the Salic law, which had originally dealt with inheritance of land among the Salian Franks. The nobles interpreted this law to mean that the French crown could not pass through a female line. Since Edward's claim came through his mother Isabella, it was declared invalid. The crown, they argued, must pass to the nearest male relative in the male line, and that was Philip of Valois. In April 1328, Philip of Valois was crowned King Philip VI of France at Reims Cathedral, the traditional coronation site of French kings. He was 35 years old, an experienced warrior and administrator who had served the last Capetian kings faithfully. He was tall, handsome, and chivalrous, the very image of medieval kingship. The House of Valois had begun its long reign over France. The early years of Philip VI's reign gave little indication of the catastrophes to come. The new king moved quickly to consolidate his position, and initially even Edward III seemed to accept the situation. In 1329, Edward travelled to France and performed homage to Philip for his French territories, acknowledging the Valois king as his feudal overlord for the Duchy of Aquitaine and other English possessions on the continent. But this apparent acceptance was merely a tactical retreat. Edward was young, only 17 when Philip took the throne, and his position in England was not yet secure. His mother Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer had effectively controlled England since deposing Edward's father in 1327, and the young king needed time to establish his own authority. Once he had done so, executing Mortimer and sidelining his mother in 1330, Edward began to look with new eyes at the French succession. The relationship between the two kings deteriorated steadily throughout the 1330s. Philip provided support to the Scots, England's traditional enemies, while Edward harboured French nobles who had fallen out of favour with the Valois regime. Disputes over the status of English territories in France, particularly the rich wine-producing region of Aquitaine, created constant friction. The feudal relationship that required the English king to pay homage to the French king for his continental possessions was a source of endless humiliation for Edward, who considered himself Philip's equal or superior. The final break came in 1337. Philip declared that Edward had forfeited his French territories due to various alleged violations of his feudal obligations. Edward responded by formally claiming the French crown for himself, quartering the royal arms of France with those of England. The 100 Years' War had begun, though no one at the time could have imagined that the conflict would last for over a century and would transform both kingdoms beyond recognition. The opening phase of the war went disastrously for France. Edward proved to be a military genius of the first order, while Philip, for all his chivalric virtues, was repeatedly outmanoeuvred and outfought. The English developed new tactical methods centred on the devastating power of the longbow, a weapon that could pierce armour at ranges that made traditional cavalry charges suicidal. The first great English victory came at the naval battle of Slees in 1340, where Edward's fleet destroyed the French navy so completely that, according to legend, no one dared tell Philip the news. When he finally learned of the disaster, the king reportedly said that the fish had drunk so much French blood they would have spoken French if they could. But Slees was merely a prelude to the catastrophe that awaited France at Crécy in August 1346. Edward had landed in Normandy with a relatively small army and conducted a devastating raid through northern France, burning and pillaging as he went. Philip gathered a massive feudal host to intercept the English, confident that his superior numbers would crush the invaders. The two armies met near the village of Crécy and Poitiers on August 26, 1346. Philip commanded perhaps 30,000 men, including the flower of French chivalry, against Edward's force of roughly 12,000. The French were supremely confident, certain that their armoured knights would sweep away the English rabble. What followed was one of the most one-sided battles in medieval history. The English had taken up a strong defensive position on a ridge, with their longbowmen deployed in formations that created interlocking fields of fire. When the French attacked, they were met by a storm of arrows that darkened the sky. The Genoese crossbowmen, who formed the vanguard of Philip's army, were cut down before they could even come within range. When the French knights charged, they had to ride over the bodies of their own allies while arrows rained down upon them from all directions. Charge after charge broke against the English lines. The French nobility, bound by codes of honour that demanded they prove their courage in personal combat, refused to retreat even as their comrades fell around them. King Philip himself had 2 horses killed beneath him and was wounded by an arrow. By the time darkness fell, the French army had been destroyed. The dead included Philip's brother, the Duke of Alençon, the King of Bohemia, who had insisted on fighting despite being blind, and over 1,000 French knights and nobles. Crécy was a disaster from which Philip VI never recovered. The following year, Edward captured the vital port city of Calais after a long siege, giving England a permanent foothold on the French coast that would remain in English hands for over 200 years. Philip attempted to relieve the city, but arrived too late, forced to watch helplessly as the starving garrison surrendered. As if military defeat were not enough, France was about to face an enemy against which no army could stand. In 1348, the Black Death arrived in Europe, carried by ships from the east. This devastating plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, would kill between 30 and 60% of Europe's population over the next few years. France was hit particularly hard, with some regions losing 2/3 of their inhabitants. The plague transformed European society in ways that went far beyond the immediate death toll. Labour became scarce and expensive, undermining the feudal system that depended on abundant peasant workers. Traditional social hierarchies were disrupted as entire noble families died out, and new men rose to fill the gaps. Religious faith was shaken as prayers and processions failed to halt the disease's advance. The psychological trauma of watching friends, family and neighbours die in agony left scars that would take generations to heal. Philip VI survived the plague, but never recovered his former vigour. He died in August 1350, leaving behind a kingdom that was militarily humiliated, economically devastated, and demographically shattered. The first Valois king had begun his reign with such promise, but he bequeathed to his successor a realm in crisis. John II, who succeeded his father as King of France in 1350, was in many ways typical of the Valois monarchs. He was brave to the point of recklessness, devoted to the ideals of chivalry, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. He was also suspicious, quick-tempered, and prone to making enemies through his impulsive actions. His contemporaries called him John the Good, though historians have debated whether this epithet referred to his personal bravery or was used ironically given the disasters of his reign. John inherited all of his father's problems and soon added new ones of his own. The war with England continued, though a truce following the Black Death provided a few years of relative peace. More immediately, dangerous was the growing power of Charles of Navarre, a prince of the blood who had his own claims to the French throne, and who proved to be a master of intrigue and betrayal. Charles of Navarre, known to history as Charles the Bad, was the grandson of Louis X through his mother. He believed that his claim to the French crown was superior to that of the Valois, and spent his entire career plotting to advance his interests at the expense of the French monarchy. He was charming, intelligent, and utterly unscrupulous, willing to ally with anyone, including the English, to achieve his goals. The relationship between John and Charles deteriorated rapidly after John became king. In 1354, Charles arranged the murder of the Constable of France, Charles of Spain, who was one of John's closest favourites. The king was furious, but initially lacked the power to punish Charles, who retreated to his territories in Normandy and began negotiating with the English. John eventually lured Charles to a feast in Rouen in April 1356, where he had the prince arrested along with several of his supporters. Some of Charles' followers were immediately executed, while Charles himself was imprisoned. This dramatic action temporarily removed one threat to John's authority, but it also created a martyr around whom opposition to the king could rally. The imprisonment of Charles of Navarre came at the worst possible moment, for England was preparing a new offensive. Edward III's son, Edward the Black Prince, had been conducting devastating raids through southern France from his base in Aquitaine. In the summer of 1356, the Black Prince led a large raiding force north toward the Loire Valley, burning and pillaging as he went. John gathered his army and marched south to intercept the English. The two forces met near Poitiers on September 19th, 1356, in a battle that would prove even more catastrophic for France than Crécy had been. The Black Prince had perhaps 6,000 men, while John commanded at least twice that number, possibly more. The French had learned nothing from Crécy. Once again, armoured knights charged uphill against prepared English positions. Once again, the longbows cut them down in swathes. But at Poitiers, there was an additional humiliation. King John himself was captured on the battlefield, along with his youngest son Philip and dozens of the greatest nobles of France. The capture of the king threw France into chaos. John was taken to England, where he would spend the next 4 years as a prisoner, living in considerable comfort but utterly unable to influence events in his kingdom. His eldest son, the 18-year-old Dauphin Charles, was left to govern a realm that was falling apart. The Dauphin faced challenges that would have overwhelmed a much more experienced ruler. The treasury was empty, the army was destroyed, and the most powerful nobles were either dead, captured, or in rebellion. The Estates General, the representative assembly of the three orders of French society, demanded sweeping reforms in exchange for granting the taxes needed to continue the war and ransom the king. Led by Etienne Marcel, the provost of the merchants of Paris, the estates sought to limit royal power and establish something approaching constitutional government. The Dauphin initially had no choice but to accept these demands, but he worked constantly to undermine the reformers and reassert royal authority. The situation was complicated by the release of Charles of Navarre from prison in November 1357. Charles immediately began plotting with Marcel and the reformers, seeing an opportunity to advance his own claims to power. The crisis reached its peak in February 1358, when a mob led by Marcel invaded the Dauphin's residence and murdered 2 of his closest advisers before his eyes. The Dauphin was forced to don the red and blue hood that was the symbol of the Parisian reformers, publicly humiliated in his own capital. But Charles was already planning his escape and his revenge. Meanwhile, the countryside exploded in the most violent peasant uprising France had ever seen. The Jacquerie, as it came to be called, began in late May 1358 in the region north of Paris. Peasants who had suffered years of war, plague and taxation finally snapped. They attacked noble manors, killing lords and their families with savage brutality. The violence spread rapidly, threatening to engulf the entire kingdom in class warfare. The nobles responded with equal brutality. Charles of Navarre, despite his alliance with the urban reformers, led the suppression of the Jacquerie, slaughtering peasants by the thousands. The uprising was crushed within weeks, but it left deep scars on French society and demonstrated the fragility of the social order. The Dauphin used the chaos to escape from Paris and rally loyal forces in the countryside. Etienne Marcel, increasingly desperate, opened negotiations with Charles of Navarre and even with the English. But his support in Paris was crumbling, and in July 1358 he was assassinated by his own followers. The Dauphin returned to Paris in triumph, and the reform movement collapsed. The immediate crisis was over, but France remained in desperate straits. The war continued, and the English demands for John's ransom were ruinous. The Treaty of Bretigny, signed in 1360, ended the first phase of the 100 Years' War, but at an enormous cost. Edward III received full sovereignty over a vastly expanded Aquitaine, covering roughly a third of France. John's ransom was set at 3 million gold crowns, an almost unimaginable sum that would take years to pay. John returned to France in 1360, but he was a broken man. The ransom payments proved impossible to collect, and when one of the hostages who had been sent to England as security for the payments escaped, John felt honour-bound to return to captivity himself. He died in London in April 1364, still a prisoner, the first French king to die in enemy hands since the days of the Carolingians. The Dauphin, who had governed France so effectively during his father's captivity, now became King Charles V. He was 26 years old, physically frail, and utterly unlike the chivalric ideal that his father and grandfather had embodied. Where they had been warriors, Charles was a scholar. Where they had been impulsive, he was calculating. Where they had sought glory on the battlefield, Charles preferred to work through diplomacy, administration, and careful planning. His contemporaries would call him Charles the Wise, and he would prove to be exactly the king that France needed. Charles understood that France could not defeat England through direct military confrontation. The disasters at Crécy and Poitiers had demonstrated the futility of sending armoured knights against English longbows. Instead, Charles developed a strategy of attrition, avoiding pitched battles while wearing down the English through raids, sieges, and the systematic recovery of lost territories. The key to this strategy was the appointment of Bertrand du Guesclin as Constable of France in 1370. Du Guesclin was an unlikely hero, a minor Breton nobleman who was famously ugly and had risen through the ranks entirely on merit. He was not a great tactician in the traditional sense, but he understood that war was not about glory, but about results. He taught the French to fight like the English, using ambushes, raids, and sieges rather than grand cavalry charges. Under Du Guesclin's leadership, the French slowly clawed back the territories they had lost. Town after town, castle after castle, returned to French allegiance. The English, stretched thin and lacking the resources for major offensive operations, could do little to stop the erosion of their position. By the time of Charles's death in 1380, France had recovered most of the land ceded at Bretigny, and English possessions were reduced to a few coastal enclaves. Charles V's achievements extended far beyond military recovery. He reformed the French tax system, creating regular sources of revenue that did not require constant negotiation with the Estates General. He rebuilt the royal administration, staffing it with educated professionals rather than relying solely on nobles. He patronised learning and the arts, building the famous library at the Louvre that would become the foundation of the French National Library. He commissioned translations of classical works into French, promoting the vernacular language as a vehicle for serious intellectual discourse. The king also had to navigate the treacherous waters of the Great Schism that divided Western Christendom, beginning in 1378. Two rival popes, one in Rome and one in Avignon, each claimed to be the legitimate successor of St. Peter. Charles supported the Avignon Pope, Clement VII, a decision that aligned France with Scotland, Castile, and other powers against England, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Italian states that supported the Roman Pope. The schism would not be resolved for nearly 40 years and would cause immense damage to the prestige and authority of the Church. Charles V died in September 1380, leaving behind a kingdom that was stronger, more prosperous, and better governed than it had been in decades. But he also left behind a 12-year-old son, Charles VI, and the prospect of a long minority during which all the gains of the previous reign might be lost. The early years of Charles VI's reign were dominated by his uncles, the Dukes of Anjou, Berry, Burgundy, and Bourbon, who competed for influence and plundered the royal treasury for their own benefit. The careful fiscal policies of Charles V were abandoned, and the kingdom's finances deteriorated rapidly. Popular resentment against the Regency government erupted in a series of urban revolts, including the Maillotins uprising in Paris in 1382, which was brutally suppressed. Charles VI took personal control of the government in 1388, dismissing his uncles and recalling the experienced administrators who had served his father. For a few years, it seemed that the young king might follow in his father's footsteps, restoring good government and continuing the recovery of France. He was handsome, athletic, and popular, everything a medieval king should be. Then in August 1392, disaster struck. Charles was leading an army through the forest of Le Mans when he suddenly went mad. He attacked his own companions, killing several knights before he could be restrained. When he recovered his senses, he had no memory of what had happened. This was the first of many episodes of madness that would afflict Charles for the rest of his life. During his lucid periods, he could function as king, but these periods became increasingly rare and brief as the years passed. During his mad episodes, he did not recognize his own family, believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched, and had to be cared for like a child. The king, who should have been in the prime of his reign, was instead a helpless invalid, and France was left without effective leadership. The power vacuum created by Charles's madness was filled by two competing factions that would tear France apart in civil war. On one side was Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's younger brother, who had been given control of the government during Charles's incapacity. Louis was charming, cultured, and ambitious, but he was also reckless and corrupt, using his position to enrich himself and his followers at the kingdom's expense. On the other side was Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, the king's uncle, who believed that he should control the government as the senior male relative. Philip had built Burgundy into a powerful principality that included not only the duchy itself, but also the wealthy counties of Flanders, Artois, and other territories in the Low Countries. The Burgundian dukes commanded resources that rivaled those of the French crown, and pursued their own foreign policy that often conflicted with French interests. Philip the Bold died in 1404, but his son John the Fearless continued the rivalry with Orleans with even greater intensity. The conflict between the two factions paralysed the French government and prevented any effective response to renewed English aggression. The situation reached a crisis point in November 1407, when John the Fearless arranged the assassination of Louis of Orleans on a Paris street. John initially denied involvement, but then brazenly admitted to ordering the murder, claiming that it was justified tyrannicide. The killing plunged France into open civil war between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, as the Orleans faction came to be called after Bernard of Armagnac became its leader. For the next several years, the two factions fought for control of Paris and the person of the Mad King. The capital changed hands repeatedly, and each change of power was accompanied by massacres and proscriptions. The government ceased to function effectively, and the kingdom's defences were neglected as French nobles killed each other instead of preparing for the English threat. That threat materialised in August 1415, when King Henry V of England landed in Normandy with an army of about 12,000 men. Henry was a new kind of English king, young, energetic, and utterly determined to press his claim to the French crown. He had spent years preparing for this invasion, building up his military forces and securing his position in England. Henry's campaign began with the siege of Harfleur, which held out for over a month before surrendering. The siege cost Henry dearly in time and men, and by the time Harfleur fell, his army was reduced by disease and casualties to perhaps 6,000 effective soldiers. Rather than retreat to England, Henry decided to march overland to Calais, a decision that seemed to invite disaster. The French gathered an enormous army to intercept the English, perhaps 20,000 men or more. The two forces met near the village of Agincourt on October 25th, 1415, St. Crispin's Day. The French were confident of victory, certain that their superior numbers would overwhelm the exhausted and hungry English. What followed was the greatest English victory of the entire 100 Years' War. The battlefield was a narrow strip of recently ploughed land between two woods, which negated the French numerical advantage and funneled their attacks into the killing zone of the English longbows. The French made all the same mistakes they had made at Crécy and Poitiers, charging headlong into a storm of arrows. The slaughter was appalling. Thousands of French knights and nobles were killed, including 3 dukes, 90 counts, and over 1,500 other nobles. Thousands more were captured, including the Duke of Orleans, who would spend the next 25 years as a prisoner in England. The French army was destroyed, and the road to conquest lay open before Henry. The years following Agincourt saw the systematic English conquest of Normandy and much of northern France. Henry proved to be as skilled at siege warfare as he was at pitched battle, methodically reducing French strongholds one by one. The French, paralysed by the ongoing civil war between Burgundians and Armagnacs, could offer no effective resistance. The situation reached its nadir in 1419 with another assassination that would have far-reaching consequences. John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, agreed to meet with the Dauphin Charles, the heir to the French throne, on the bridge at Montereau to discuss a possible reconciliation between the two factions. During the meeting, members of the Dauphin's entourage murdered John, splitting his skull with an axe. Whether the Dauphin ordered or even knew about the assassination in advance remains disputed, but the consequences were catastrophic for France. John's son and successor, Philip the Good, immediately allied with England to avenge his father's murder. The most powerful French prince had become an English ally, and the Valois cause seemed lost. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in May 1420, formalised the disaster. King Charles VI, still intermittently mad, was compelled to disinherit his own son and recognise Henry V as his heir. Henry married Charles's daughter Catherine, cementing the arrangements. When Charles VI died, the crowns of France and England would be united in Henry's person, and the Valois dynasty would come to an end. Henry V died unexpectedly in August 1422, just 2 months before Charles VI. The English king was only 35, struck down by dysentery during a siege. His infant son, Henry VI, inherited both crowns, though of course a baby could not actually rule. England and English-occupied France were governed by regents, while the disinherited Dauphin Charles maintained a precarious hold on the territories south of the Loire. The Dauphin, who styled himself King Charles VII despite the Treaty of Troyes, controlled perhaps a third of France. He held court at Bourges and other cities in the centre and south of the kingdom, but his position seemed hopeless. The English and their Burgundian allies controlled Paris, Normandy, and most of the north. The Dauphin's own legitimacy was questionable, for rumours circulated that he was not actually the son of Charles VI, but the product of his mother's adultery. Charles himself seemed to have little fight in him. He was physically unprepossessing, with thin legs that made him look ridiculous on horseback. He was indecisive, easily influenced by favourites, and prone to bouts of depression. His court was riven by factions, and his treasury was empty. Year after year, the English advanced, and it seemed only a matter of time before they completed their conquest. Then in 1429 a miracle occurred. A 17-year-old peasant girl from the village of Domremy appeared at Charles' court claiming that saints had commanded her to drive the English from France and see Charles crowned at Reims. Her name was Joan of Arc, and she would change the course of history. Joan's story is one of the most remarkable in all of medieval history. She was illiterate, had never held a weapon, and had no military training whatsoever, yet she convinced the desperate Charles to give her command of an army and led it to victory after victory against the English. Within months of her arrival, she had lifted the siege of Orleans, defeated the English in open battle at Patay, and escorted Charles to Reims, where he was crowned King of France in the traditional ceremony that gave him legitimacy in the eyes of his subjects. The coronation at Reims on July 17, 1429, was the turning point of the 100 Years' War. Charles was no longer the disinherited Dauphin, but the anointed King of France, blessed by God and the Church. The psychological impact was enormous. French morale soared, while English confidence was shaken. Towns that had accepted English rule began to reconsider their allegiance. Joan's military career was brief. She was captured by Burgundian forces in May 1430 and sold to the English, who put her on trial for heresy and witchcraft. The trial was a travesty, designed to discredit both Joan and the king she had crowned. In May 1431, Joan was burned at the stake in Rouen, only 19 years old. She would be rehabilitated by the Church in 1456 and canonised as a saint in 1920. Charles VII did nothing to save Joan, a failure that has stained his reputation ever since. But whatever his personal failings, Charles proved to be an effective king in the years following his coronation. He was not a warrior, but he was a shrewd politician who understood how to use others to achieve his goals. The key to Charles's ultimate victory was the reconciliation with Burgundy. Philip the Good, despite his alliance with England, was fundamentally a French prince who had no desire to see his homeland permanently subjected to English rule. The English, for their part, treated their Burgundian allies with increasing arrogance and failed to deliver on their promises of territorial gains. The Treaty of Arras in 1435 brought Burgundy back into the French fold. Philip the Good acknowledged Charles as the legitimate King of France in exchange for extensive territorial concessions and a formal apology for the murder of John the Fearless. The English were outraged, but could do nothing to prevent the defection of their most important ally. With Burgundy neutralised, Charles could concentrate on driving out the English. The reconquest proceeded slowly but steadily over the next 2 decades. Paris fell in 1436, Normandy was recovered between 1449 and 1450, and Aquitaine, which had been English for 300 years, was conquered in 1451 through 1453. The Battle of Castillon in July 1453, where the English commander John Talbot was killed, marks the effective end of the 100 Years' War. Charles VII's achievement was remarkable. He had inherited a kingdom that seemed on the verge of extinction and left it stronger and more unified than it had been in over a century. But his success was due not only to military victory, but also to administrative reforms that transformed the French state. The most important of these reforms was the creation of a permanent standing army. the first in Western Europe since Roman times. The Compagnies d'Ordonnance, established in 1445, were professional cavalry units, paid directly by the crown and loyal to the king rather than to individual nobles. They were supplemented by the Franks archers, infantry recruited from the common people, who were exempted from certain taxes in exchange for military service. For the first time, the French king had reliable military forces that did not depend on the goodwill of his vassals. Charles also reformed the kingdom's finances, establishing regular taxes that could be collected without the consent of the Estates General. The taille, a direct tax on commoners, and the gabelle, a tax on salt, became permanent features of the French fiscal system. These revenues gave the crown financial independence and the ability to maintain its new standing army without constantly begging for funds from representative assemblies. The reorganization of the French military went far beyond simply creating new units. Charles and his advisors understood that the disasters of the previous century had resulted from fundamental flaws in how France waged war. The feudal levy, which had formed the backbone of French armies for centuries, was simply not suited to the demands of prolonged conflict against a professional enemy. Knights who owed only 40 days of service per year could not conduct the sustained campaigns necessary to recover lost territory. Nobles who viewed war as an opportunity for personal glory rather than a collective enterprise could not be relied upon to follow coherent strategies. The Compagnie d'Ordonnance solved these problems by creating a force that was always available, always trained, and always under royal command. Each company consisted of 100 lances, with each lance comprising a man-at-arms, a coutelier, who served as a lighter cavalryman, 2 archers, a page, and a servant. The total strength of the ordnance companies was initially about 9,000 men, a relatively small force but one of unprecedented quality and reliability. These soldiers were paid regular wages, which meant they had no need to plunder the countryside to support themselves. They were housed in designated garrisons rather than being billeted on the civilian population. They trained constantly, developing skills and unit cohesion that feudal levies could never match. And they were loyal to the king who paid them, not to local lords who might have their own agendas. The Franks archers represented a different approach to military reform. Rather than creating a professional infantry force, Charles sought to develop a trained militia that could be called upon in times of need. Every parish was required to provide 1 archer, equipped with a bow and basic armour, who would train regularly and be ready to serve when summoned. These men were exempted from the taille, hence their name, and were expected to maintain their own equipment. The Franks archers were never as effective as the Compagnie d'Ordonnance, and they would eventually be replaced by foreign mercenaries and native professional infantry. But they represented an important step in the development of French military power, demonstrating that the crown could mobilise the kingdom's human resources in new and more efficient ways. Artillery was another area where Charles VII made crucial advances. The French had used cannons since the early 14th century, but they had generally been slow, unreliable, and of limited tactical value. Under Charles, the brothers John and Gaspard Bureau revolutionised French artillery, developing lighter and more mobile guns that could be used effectively in both sieges and field battles. The Bureau brothers' innovations proved decisive in the final campaigns of the 100 Years' War. At Formigny in 1450, French artillery helped destroy an English army in Normandy. At Castillon in 1453, the English commander Talbot led a charge against what he thought was a retreating French force, only to find himself attacking a fortified artillery park. The English were slaughtered, and Talbot himself was killed. It was a fitting end to a war that had begun with English technological superiority in the longbow, and ended with French technological superiority in gunpowder weapons. Charles VII's administrative reforms were equally important. He reorganised the Royal Council, creating specialised bodies to handle different aspects of government. The Parliament of Paris, which served as the kingdom's highest court, was reformed and its procedures standardised. Provincial parliaments were established in Toulouse, Grenoble, Bordeaux, and other cities, extending royal justice throughout the kingdom. The king also worked to reduce the power of the great nobles who had caused so much trouble during the Civil War period. He confiscated the lands of those who had collaborated with the English and distributed them to loyal supporters. He appointed royal officials to oversee the administration of noble territories, gradually extending the reach of central government into areas that had previously been largely autonomous. The Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges, issued in 1438, asserted the independence of the French Church from papal control. This document declared that church councils were superior to popes, that the French Church had the right to administer its own affairs, and that papal appointments and taxation in France required royal consent. While the Pragmatic Sanction was never fully enforced, it established principles that would shape relations between the French crown and the papacy for centuries. Charles's later years were troubled by conflict with his own son, the future Louis the Eleventh. The Dauphin Louis was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly impatient with his father's cautious approach to governance. He participated in a noble rebellion called the Praguery in 1440, which Charles suppressed without great difficulty. Relations between father and son never recovered, and Louis eventually fled to the court of Philip the Good of Burgundy, where he remained until his father's death. Charles VII died on July 22, 1461, at the age of 58. He had reigned for 39 years, longer than any French king since Philip IV. He had inherited a kingdom on the verge of destruction and left it united, prosperous, and powerful. The 100 Years' War was over, and France had won. The House of Valois, which had seemed doomed to extinction just 3 decades earlier, was now more secure than ever. Yet Charles died a troubled man. In his final years, he became convinced that his son was plotting to poison him and refused to eat for fear of assassination. He developed an abscess in his mouth that made eating painful, and his refusal to take nourishment eventually killed him. It was a sad end for a king who had achieved so much, haunted to the last by fears and suspicions that may or may not have been justified. The new king, Louis the Eleventh, was 38 years old when he inherited the throne, and he was unlike any French monarch who had come before. Where his predecessors had cultivated the image of chivalric warriors, Louis deliberately rejected such pretensions. He dressed simply, often in plain grey or brown clothing that made him look more like a merchant than a king. He avoided tournaments and other martial displays, preferring to spend his time in conversation with advisors, merchants, and even common people. He was physically unprepossessing, with a long nose, thin lips, and eyes that contemporaries described as penetrating and unsettling. Louis's enemies called him the universal spider, a reference to his habit of spinning webs of intrigue that trapped his opponents before they even realised they were in danger. He preferred diplomacy to war, bribery to battle, and patience to glory. He was willing to wait years for his plans to come to fruition, and he never forgot a slight or abandoned a grudge. He was also deeply religious in his own peculiar way, collecting relics obsessively and making pilgrimages to obscure shrines, while simultaneously lying, cheating, and manipulating his way to power. The great challenge of Louis's reign was the same challenge that had faced his predecessors: the power of the great nobles, particularly the Duke of Burgundy. Philip the Good had died in 1467, succeeded by his son Charles, who would become known as Charles the Bold. Charles was everything Louis was not: tall, handsome, brave, and devoted to the ideals of chivalry. He dreamed of recreating the ancient kingdom of Lotharingia, a middle kingdom stretching from the North Sea to the Mediterranean that would be independent of both France and the Holy Roman Empire. The conflict between Louis and Charles dominated European politics for nearly a decade. It was a clash not only of personalities but of visions for the future. Charles represented the old world of feudal princes where great lords ruled their territories as virtually independent sovereigns, and the king was merely first among equals. Louis represented the new world of centralized monarchy, where royal authority extended into every corner of the kingdom, and noble power was subordinated to the crown. Louis began his reign by making a serious mistake. He dismissed many of his father's experienced advisers and replaced them with his own men, alienating powerful interests throughout the kingdom. He also antagonized the Duke of Burgundy by buying back the Somme towns that Charles VII had ceded in the Treaty of Arras, a transaction that was legal but which Philip the Good considered a personal insult. The result was the War of the Public Weal in 1465, a great noble rebellion that united virtually all the major princes of France against the king. Charles the Bold, then still Count of Charolais, was the military leader of the coalition, which also included the Duke of Brittany, the Duke of Bourbon, and Louis's own brother Charles, who had been granted the Duchy of Berry. Louis faced the rebels with inferior forces, and the Battle of Montlhéry in July 1465 was indecisive, with both sides claiming victory. But the king was in a dangerous position, with enemies on all sides and few reliable allies. He was forced to make humiliating concessions in the Treaty of Conflans, restoring the Somme towns to Burgundy and granting extensive territories and privileges to the other rebel lords. Most kings would have accepted this defeat and tried to make the best of a bad situation. Louis instead began immediately planning his revenge. He understood that the coalition against him was held together only by shared opposition to royal power, and that the princes had conflicting interests that could be exploited. Over the next several years, he worked tirelessly to divide his enemies, playing them against each other with a combination of bribes, promises, and carefully planted suspicions. The king's opportunity came in 1468, when he made the reckless decision to meet Charles the Bold at Péronne to negotiate a settlement of their disputes. While Louis was at Péronne, news arrived that the city of Liège, which had been encouraged by French agents to rebel against Burgundian authority, had risen in revolt. Charles was furious, believing that Louis had deliberately humiliated him, and for several days the French king was effectively a prisoner, uncertain whether he would be allowed to leave alive. Louis escaped from Péronne only by agreeing to accompany Charles on a punitive expedition against Liège and by making further territorial concessions. It was the lowest point of his reign, a humiliation that he never forgot and never forgave. But Louis learned from his mistakes. He would never again put himself in such a vulnerable position, and he would spend the rest of his reign working to destroy the Burgundian state that had humiliated him. The destruction of Burgundy became Louis's obsession. He could not defeat Charles the Bold in open battle, for the Burgundian army was the finest in Europe, but he could encourage Charles's enemies and wait for the Duke to overreach himself. Louis subsidized the Swiss Confederation, which had its own conflicts with Burgundy over territory in the Alps. He maintained contacts with disaffected elements within the Burgundian domains, and he waited. Charles the Bold provided Louis with the opportunity he needed by embarking on an ambitious campaign to connect his scattered territories and create a unified Burgundian kingdom. This required conquering the Duchy of Lorraine, which lay between Burgundy proper and the Burgundian possessions in the Low Countries. Charles invaded Lorraine in 1475 and quickly conquered it, but his success alarmed his neighbours and created a coalition against him. The Swiss, subsidized by Louis, declared war on Burgundy in 1476. Charles marched against them with supreme confidence, certain that his professional army would easily defeat the peasant infantry of the mountain cantons. He was catastrophically wrong. At Grandson, in March 1476, the Swiss routed the Burgundian army and captured Charles's magnificent camp with all its treasures. At Morat in June, the Swiss inflicted an even more devastating defeat, killing perhaps 10,000 Burgundian soldiers. Charles refused to accept these disasters. He raised a new army and marched against the Duke of Lorraine, who had recaptured his duchy while Charles was fighting the Swiss. In January 1477, Charles besieged the city of Nancy, the Lorraine capital. A relief army of Swiss and Lorraine troops approached, and Charles, despite being outnumbered and his army weakened by cold and hunger, insisted on giving battle. The Battle of Nancy on January 5, 1477, was the end of Charles the Bold and of Burgundian independence. The Burgundian army was destroyed, and Charles himself was killed, his body found days later in a frozen pond, stripped naked and partially eaten by wolves. The greatest prince in Europe, the man who had dreamed of a crown, died alone and unmourned on a frozen battlefield. Louis moved immediately to exploit Charles's death. The Duke of Burgundy left only a daughter, Mary, and Louis claimed that the Burgundian territories should revert to the French crown under Salic law. He invaded and occupied the Duchy of Burgundy itself, along with Picardy and other territories. But Mary quickly married Maximilian of Habsburg, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor, bringing the wealthy Low Countries into the Habsburg orbit. This marriage would have consequences that Louis could not have foreseen, eventually leading to the encirclement of France by Habsburg power that would dominate European politics for the next 2 centuries. Louis spent his remaining years consolidating his gains and continuing to expand royal power. He acquired Anjou, Maine and Provence through inheritance when their ruling dynasties died out. He suppressed the last independent tendencies of the great nobles, reducing them to courtiers dependent on royal favour. He promoted trade and industry, understanding that a prosperous kingdom was a powerful kingdom. He established royal postal routes that improved communication throughout the realm. He patronised the new technology of printing, recognising its potential for spreading information and royal propaganda. The king's methods were often ruthless. He made extensive use of imprisonment without trial, holding enemies in iron cages that became notorious symbols of his tyranny. He employed spies and informers throughout the kingdom, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear. He broke promises when it suited him and showed no mercy to those who opposed him. Yet he was also capable of generosity to those who served him well, and he genuinely cared about the welfare of the common people, who suffered most from noble warfare and disorder. Louis's health declined in his final years. He suffered a series of strokes that left him partially paralysed and increasingly paranoid. He retreated to his castle of Plessis-les-Tours, surrounding himself with guards and rarely venturing outside. He became obsessed with prolonging his life, summoning doctors and holy men from across Europe and paying enormous sums for supposed cures and relics. He even sent to the King of Portugal for a rhinoceros horn, believed to have magical healing properties. Louis the 11th died on August 30th, 1483, at the age of 60. He had reigned for 22 years and had transformed France from a feudal kingdom into something approaching a modern state. The great nobles who had once challenged royal authority were broken. The territorial consolidation of France was nearly complete. The machinery of royal government was stronger and more efficient than ever before. Yet Louis's legacy was ambiguous. His methods had been so ruthless, his personality so unappealing, that he was widely hated during his lifetime and for long afterward. Later generations would rehabilitate his reputation, recognizing that his cold-blooded pragmatism had achieved what chivalric idealism could not. He had made France great, even if he had done so through means that offended contemporary sensibilities. Louis left behind a 13-year-old son, Charles VIII, and a kingdom that was powerful, but also filled with resentments that the old king's iron hand had suppressed. The regency that followed would have to manage these tensions while preparing the young king to rule in his own right. Charles VIII came to the throne as a boy of 13, and his minority was dominated by his elder sister, Anne of Beaujeu, who served as regent along with her husband, Pierre. Anne was very much her father's daughter, intelligent, calculating, and utterly devoted to maintaining royal authority. She faced immediate challenges from nobles who hoped to reverse Louis the Eleventh's centralizing policies, and from foreign powers who sensed an opportunity in France's temporary weakness. The most serious threat came from Louis, Duke of Orleans, who was the closest adult male relative to the young king, and who believed he should control the regency. Louis was descended from a younger son of Charles V, and thus had his own claim to the throne should Charles VIII die without heirs. He allied with Francis II, Duke of Brittany, and other discontented nobles in what became known as the Mad War of 1485 to 1488. Anne of Beaujeu handled the crisis with skill that would have made her father proud. She divided the rebel coalition through a combination of concessions and threats, isolating Louis of Orleans and the Duke of Brittany. When the rebels were finally brought to battle at Saint-Aubin-du-Cormier in July 1488, the royal forces won a decisive victory. Louis of Orleans was captured and imprisoned, though Anne wisely chose to spare his life, recognizing that executing a prince of the blood would create more problems than it solved. The defeat of the rebels opened the way for the absorption of Brittany into the French crown. Duke Francis II died shortly after the battle, leaving only a daughter, Anne, as his heir. The Duchess Anne was one of the most sought-after brides in Europe, for whoever married her would gain control of the last great independent fief in France. Charles VIII, now ruling in his own right, was determined that he would be that husband. The marriage negotiations were complicated by the fact that Anne of Brittany had already been married by proxy to Maximilian of Habsburg, the same Maximilian who had married Mary of Burgundy. But Charles was not deterred by such technicalities. He invaded Brittany with an overwhelming force, besieged the Duchess in Rennes, and compelled her to repudiate her Habsburg marriage and accept him instead. The wedding took place in December 1491, and Brittany was united with France, though it would retain its own institutions and privileges for many years to come. Charles VIII was now master of a united France, and he began to dream of greater glories. He was not an impressive figure physically, being short with a large head, thick lips, and poor eyesight. He was also not particularly intelligent, preferring romances about chivalric heroes to serious study of statecraft. But he was ambitious, and he had inherited from his father a kingdom with the resources to pursue grand ambitions. The object of Charles's dreams was Italy, the richest and most cultured region in Europe, but also the most politically fragmented. The Italian peninsula was divided among numerous states, including the Papal States, the Kingdom of Naples, the Duchy of Milan, the republics of Venice and Florence, and many smaller principalities. These states were constantly at war with each other, forming and breaking alliances in a complex dance of diplomacy that would later inspire Machiavelli's famous treatise on politics. Charles had a claim to the Kingdom of Naples through his father's inheritance of the rights of the House of Anjou, which had ruled Naples in the 13th and 14th centuries before being displaced by a branch of the Spanish House of Aragon. This claim was legally dubious, but Charles was not interested in legal niceties. He saw himself as a crusader king who would conquer Naples, use it as a base to launch a crusade against the Ottoman Turks and liberate Constantinople and Jerusalem. It was a fantasy worthy of the chivalric romances he loved, and it would lead France into a quagmire that would last for over 60 years. The Italian expedition began in September 1494, when Charles crossed the Alps with an army of perhaps 30,000 men, the largest French force to invade Italy since the days of Charlemagne. The invasion was made possible by the diplomatic isolation of Naples, whose king had alienated potential allies through his ruthless policies. It was also facilitated by Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, who invited the French in as part of his own schemes to dominate northern Italy. Charles's march through Italy was a triumphal procession. The Italian states, divided and militarily weak, could offer no effective resistance. Florence expelled its ruling Medici family and welcomed Charles as a liberator. Rome opened its gates, and Pope Alexander VI, the infamous Borgia Pope, was forced to grant Charles passage through the Papal States. Naples itself fell almost without a fight, its Aragonese king fleeing to Sicily as Charles entered the city in February 1495. For a brief moment, Charles was master of Italy. He was crowned King of Naples and began making plans for his crusade against the Turks. But his triumph was built on sand. The French soldiers alienated the Neapolitan population through their arrogance and rapacity. The Italian states, alarmed by French power, formed the League of Venice to drive out the invaders, and Spain, whose ruling house was related to the displaced Aragonese dynasty of Naples, prepared to intervene. Charles realised that he had overextended himself and began a hasty retreat northward. The League of Venice attempted to block his path at Fornovo in July 1495, but Charles broke through in a confused battle that both sides claimed as a victory. The French king escaped to France, but his Italian conquests melted away behind him. Within a year of his departure, Naples was back in Aragonese hands, and all that remained of Charles's grand adventure was debt, exhaustion, and the memory of what might have been. Yet the Italian expedition had consequences that far outlasted Charles's brief conquest. It revealed to the rest of Europe the wealth and cultural sophistication of Italy, sparking a fascination with Italian art, literature, and ideas that would transform European civilization. It also demonstrated the military weakness of the Italian states, making the peninsula a battleground for foreign powers that would fight over it for the next 4 centuries, and it established a French claim to Italian territories that subsequent kings would feel obligated to pursue, drawing France into an endless series of wars that would drain its resources and distract it from more pressing concerns. Charles VIII did not live to pursue his Italian dreams further. On April 7, 1498, while at the châteaux of Amboise, he struck his head on a low doorway and died within hours, probably from a cerebral hemorrhage. He was only 27 years old and had reigned for 15 years. He left no surviving children, for all his offspring by Anne of Brittany had died in infancy. With Charles's death, the direct line of Valois kings came to an end. The crown passed to Louis, Duke of Orleans, the same Louis who had rebelled against the regency and been imprisoned after Saint-Aubin du Cormier. He became King Louis XII, and a new branch of the Valois family took control of France. Louis XII was 36 years old when he inherited the throne, a mature man who had experienced both the heights of princely privilege and the depths of imprisonment and disgrace. He was the great-grandson of Charles V, descended from that king's younger son, Louis, Duke of Orleans, who had been assassinated by John the Fearless in 1407. The new king was thus a Valois, but from a cadet branch that had never expected to inherit the crown. Louis's first act as king was to seek an annulment of his marriage to Jeanne of France, the daughter of Louis the 11th. This marriage had been forced upon him by the old king, who hoped that Jeanne's physical deformities would prevent her from bearing children and thus ensure that the Orleans line would die out. Louis had always resented this marriage, and now that he was king, he was determined to free himself from it. The annulment was granted by Pope Alexander VI, who had his own reasons for wanting to please the French king. Louis then married Anne of Brittany, the widow of Charles VIII, ensuring that Brittany would remain united with France. Anne was a remarkable woman, intelligent and cultured, who had already been Queen of France once and would now be Queen again. She bore Louis 2 daughters, but no sons, a failure that would have significant consequences for the succession. Louis XII proved to be a popular and effective king, earning the nickname Father of the People for his concern for the welfare of his subjects. He reduced taxes, reformed the judicial system, and worked to ensure that royal officials did not abuse their power. He was accessible to petitioners and genuinely interested in hearing grievances against his government. When told that some of his subjects were speaking ill of him, he reportedly replied that he would rather make people laugh with his stinginess than make them cry with his taxes. But Louis could not resist the lure of Italy any more than Charles VIII had. Indeed, he had even stronger claims to Italian territories than his predecessor, for he was descended from Valentina Visconti, the daughter of a Duke of Milan, and thus had a claim to the Milanese duchy, as well as the Angevin claim to Naples that he inherited with the French crown. Louis invaded Italy in 1499, and his conquest of Milan was even easier than Charles's conquest of Naples had been. Ludovico Sforza, who had invited Charles into Italy only to regret it, now found himself the target of French aggression. Milan fell quickly, and Ludovico was captured and spent the rest of his life as a prisoner in France. Louis was now Duke of Milan as well as King of France, and he began planning the conquest of Naples. The Neapolitan campaign was complicated by the involvement of Spain. Ferdinand of Aragon had his own claims to Naples, and he proposed that France and Spain divide the kingdom between them. Louis agreed, and in 1500 French and Spanish forces jointly conquered Naples, expelling the ruling Aragonese dynasty. But the two powers soon fell out over the division of the spoils, and by 1503 the Spanish had driven the French out of southern Italy entirely. The loss of Naples was a significant defeat, but Louis retained Milan and continued to pursue his Italian ambitions. The next decade saw a bewildering series of wars, alliances and betrayals, as France, Spain, the papacy, Venice, and the Holy Roman Empire fought over the Italian peninsula. Louis won some victories and suffered some defeats, but he never achieved the decisive success that would have secured French dominance in Italy. The most dangerous moment came in 1511, when Pope Julius II, the warrior pope, who was determined to drive all foreign powers from Italy, formed the Holy League against France. The League included Spain, Venice, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, a coalition of enemies that surrounded France on all sides. For a moment, it seemed that France might face invasion from multiple directions simultaneously. Louis responded with characteristic energy, raising new armies and seeking allies wherever he could find them. The French won a great victory at Ravenna in April 1512, but it was a Pyrrhic triumph that cost them their best commander, Gaston of Foix, and failed to break the League. By the end of 1512, the French had been driven out of Italy entirely, and Milan was in the hands of the Sforza family once again. Louis's final years were marked by declining health and continuing diplomatic struggles. He made peace with his enemies one by one, abandoning his Italian claims in exchange for recognition of his position in France. He married his daughter Claude to Francis of Angoulême, the heir presumptive to the throne, ensuring that the succession would pass smoothly to the next generation of Valois. Anne of Brittany died in January 1514, and Louis, despite his age and poor health, married again, this time to Mary Tudor, the young sister of King Henry VIII of England. This marriage was part of a diplomatic rapprochement with England, but it may have hastened Louis's death. The elderly king reportedly exhausted himself trying to keep up with his 18-year-old bride, and he died on January 1st, 1515, less than 3 months after the wedding. Louis XII left behind a mixed legacy. He had been a good king in many ways, popular with his subjects, and genuinely concerned with their welfare. But his Italian adventures had consumed enormous resources and achieved nothing lasting. The French claim to Milan and Naples remained unvindicated, a source of future wars that would drain French blood and treasure for decades to come. The crown now passed to Francis of Angoulême, Louis's son-in-law and closest male relative. Francis was descended from a younger son of Louis of Orléans, the father of Louis XII, making him a Valois of the Valois-Angoulême branch. He was 20 years old, tall, handsome, athletic, and bursting with ambition. A new era was about to begin. Francis I came to the throne, determined to succeed where his predecessors had failed. He would conquer Italy, humble the enemies of France, and make himself the greatest king in Christendom. He had the resources to pursue these ambitions, for France was the most populous and wealthy kingdom in Western Europe. He had the energy and charisma to inspire his subjects, and he had the confidence, perhaps overconfidence, to believe that nothing was beyond his reach. The new king wasted no time in resuming the Italian wars. Within months of his accession, he had crossed the Alps with a powerful army and descended into Lombardy. The Swiss, who had occupied Milan after driving out the French in 1512, prepared to defend their conquest. The two armies met at Marignano in September 1515 in one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the Italian wars. Marignano was a 2-day struggle that tested both sides to their limits. The Swiss infantry, the most feared soldiers in Europe, attacked with their characteristic ferocity, and for hours the outcome hung in the balance. But Francis had brought a powerful artillery train, and the French guns tore great gaps in the Swiss formations. When Venetian reinforcements arrived on the second day, the Swiss finally retreated, leaving thousands of dead on the field. The victory at Marignano made Francis master of Milan and established his reputation as a warrior king. He followed up his military success with diplomatic triumphs, meeting Pope Leo X at Bologna and negotiating the Concordat of 1516, which gave the French crown extensive control over the church in France. He also signed the Treaty of Noyon with Spain, which temporarily ended hostilities between the two powers and seemed to promise a new era of peace. But Francis's ambitions soon brought him into conflict with a rival who would dominate European politics for the next 4 decades. In 1519, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian died, and the imperial electors gathered to choose his successor. Francis put himself forward as a candidate, believing that his wealth and power made him the obvious choice. But the electors chose instead Maximilian's grandson, Charles of Habsburg, who was already King of Spain and ruler of the Burgundian Netherlands. The election of Charles as Holy Roman Emperor. Charles V created a nightmare scenario for France. Charles now ruled Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, much of Germany, and the Spanish possessions in the New World. France was surrounded by Habsburg territories, and Charles had both the resources and the motivation to challenge French power. The rivalry between Francis and Charles would shape European history for a generation. The first major clash came in Italy, where both kings had claims and ambitions. Charles sought to recover Milan for the empire, while Francis was determined to hold what he had won at Marignano. The war that began in 1521 would continue, with interruptions, for the rest of Francis's reign and beyond. The decisive moment came at Pavia in February 1525. Francis had besieged the city with a large army, but an imperial relief force arrived and attacked the French camp. The battle was a catastrophe for France. The French army was destroyed, and Francis himself was captured, taken prisoner while fighting bravely in the thick of the combat. The capture of the French king sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Nothing like this had happened since the capture of John II at Poitiers over 150 years earlier. Francis was taken to Spain, where Charles kept him prisoner for over a year, demanding enormous concessions as the price of his release. The Treaty of Madrid, signed in January 1526, was a humiliating document that required Francis to surrender Burgundy, renounce his Italian claims, and abandon his allies. Francis signed the treaty, but he had no intention of honouring it. He had secretly protested before signing that he was acting under duress and that the agreement was therefore invalid. As soon as he was released and back in France, he repudiated the treaty and resumed the war. The conflict continued for years, with neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage. Francis formed alliances with unlikely partners, including the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, shocking Christian Europe by allying with Muslims against a fellow Christian monarch. He also allied with various German Protestant princes, despite being a Catholic king, in an effort to weaken Charles's position in the empire. The wars brought France moments of success and moments of disaster, but they never achieved Francis's ultimate goal of driving the Habsburgs from Italy and establishing French hegemony in Europe. The Peace of Crécy in 1544 essentially restored the status quo, with France retaining Burgundy but abandoning most of its Italian claims. Francis had spent his reign and his kingdom's resources in a struggle that ended more or less where it had begun. Yet Francis I's reign was far from a failure. If he did not achieve his military ambitions, he succeeded brilliantly in other areas. He was the great patron of the French Renaissance, importing Italian artists and architects to transform the French court into a centre of culture and learning. Leonardo da Vinci spent his final years in France as Francis's guest, and the king acquired paintings and sculptures that would form the foundation of the French royal art collection. Francis built magnificent châteaux in the Loire Valley and around Paris, including the enormous Palace of Chambord, which remains one of the most impressive examples of Renaissance architecture in Europe. He founded the Collège de France to promote humanist learning and established the Royal Library that would eventually become the Bibliothèque Nationale. He encouraged the use of French rather than Latin in official documents, promoting the development of the French language as a vehicle for serious literature and scholarship. The king's court was famous throughout Europe for its brilliance and sophistication. Francis surrounded himself with poets, artists, scholars, and beautiful women, creating an atmosphere of cultivated elegance that set the standard for European courts for generations. He was personally charming, witty, and generous, the very image of a Renaissance prince. Francis also strengthened the French state in important ways. He continued the centralization of power that his predecessors had begun, reducing the autonomy of the provinces and extending royal authority throughout the kingdom. He reformed the financial system, creating new taxes and new methods of collection that increased royal revenues. He built up the French navy, recognizing the importance of sea power in an age of overseas expansion. The king's religious policies were more ambiguous. Francis was personally orthodox in his beliefs, but he was also tolerant by the standards of his time, at least initially. He protected humanist scholars who were suspected of Protestant sympathies and resisted pressure from conservative churchmen to persecute those who questioned traditional doctrines. His sister, Marguerite of Navarre, was openly sympathetic to religious reform and sheltered suspected heretics at her court, and Francis allowed her considerable latitude in these matters. However, the affair of the placards in October 1534 marked a turning point in Francis's religious policy. Protestant activists posted broadsheets throughout Paris and other cities, denouncing the Catholic Mass as idolatry. One placard was even affixed to the door of the king's bedchamber at Amboise, a shocking violation of royal space that Francis took as a personal affront. The king, who had previously seen religious dissent as a matter for theologians to debate, now viewed it as a threat to public order and royal authority. The persecution that followed was severe. Suspected Protestants were arrested, tortured, and burned at the stake. Francis himself participated in a solemn procession through Paris to expiate the insult to the Catholic faith, walking bareheaded and carrying a torch while heretics were burned along the route. The relatively tolerant atmosphere of the early reign gave way to repression that would intensify under Francis's successors. Francis I died on March 31st, 1547, at the age of 52. He had reigned for 32 years, longer than any French king since Philip IV. His reign had seen France emerge as the leading power of the Renaissance, a centre of art, culture, and learning that rivaled Italy itself. But it had also seen the beginning of religious divisions that would tear the kingdom apart in the decades to come. The king was succeeded by his son Henry, who became Henry II. Francis's eldest son, also named Francis, had died in 1536, reportedly after drinking cold water while overheated from a tennis match, though poison was suspected at the time. Henry had thus been heir to the throne for over a decade, but he had always lived in his father's shadow, and his relationship with Francis had been complicated by years of mutual misunderstanding and resentment. Henry II was 28 years old when he became king, a mature man who had already developed strong opinions about how France should be governed. He was physically impressive, tall and athletic, an excellent horseman and jouster who embodied the martial ideals of Renaissance kingship. But he lacked his father's charm and intellectual curiosity, and he was dominated by powerful personalities at his court, particularly his mistress Diane de Poitiers and the constable Anne de Montmorency. Diane de Poitiers was one of the most remarkable women of the 16th century. She was nearly 20 years older than Henry, having first become his companion when he was a teenager, yet she maintained her hold over him throughout his life. She was beautiful, intelligent, and politically astute, wielding enormous influence over royal patronage and policy. Henry showered her with gifts and honours, including the magnificent châteaux of Chenonceau, and she remained the dominant woman in his life, even though he was married to Catherine de' Medici, who bore him 10 children. Catherine de' Medici was the daughter of Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, and a member of the famous Florentine banking family that had produced popes and princes. She had been married to Henry when both were teenagers, a match arranged by Pope Clement VII, who was himself a Medici. For years Catherine lived in the shadow of Diane de Poitiers, humiliated by her husband's open preference for his mistress, but unable to challenge the arrangement. She focused on bearing children, eventually producing 7 who survived infancy and waited for her time to come. Henry's reign continued the patterns established by his father. The Italian wars resumed almost immediately, with France fighting against the Habsburgs for control of the peninsula. Henry achieved some successes, including the capture of the 3 bishoprics of Metz, Toul, and Verdun from the Holy Roman Empire in 1552, territories that would remain French for centuries. But the Italian campaigns themselves produced no lasting gains, and the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis in 1559 essentially ended French ambitions in Italy, confirming Spanish dominance of the peninsula. The treaty was a recognition of reality. France simply could not compete with the combined resources of the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs, who controlled not only their European territories, but also the vast wealth flowing from the Spanish colonies in the Americas. The gold and silver of Mexico and Peru gave Spain financial resources that France could not match, and Henry wisely chose to cut his losses rather than continue a futile struggle. But if Henry abandoned the Italian dream, he found new enemies closer to home. The Protestant Reformation, which had begun in Germany in 1517, had spread to France despite royal efforts to suppress it. French Protestants, who came to be called Huguenots, were growing in number and influence, particularly among the nobility and the urban middle classes. Henry viewed Protestantism as both a religious heresy and a political threat, and he intensified the persecution that his father had begun after the affair of the placards. The Edict of Chateaubriand in 1551 established a comprehensive system for detecting and punishing heresy. Special courts called chambres ardentes, or burning chambers, were created to try suspected Protestants. Informers were encouraged with promises of rewards. The penalties for heresy included confiscation of property, imprisonment, and death by burning. Thousands of French Protestants fled abroad, while those who remained practiced their faith in secret or faced the consequences of open defiance. Yet persecution failed to stop the spread of Protestantism. The new faith offered a direct relationship with God through Scripture, without the mediation of priests and the elaborate rituals of the Catholic Church. It appealed to those who were dissatisfied with the corruption and worldliness of the established Church, to intellectuals attracted by its emphasis on individual conscience, and to nobles who saw an opportunity to appropriate church lands and revenues. By the late 1550s, there may have been as many as 2 million Huguenots in France, perhaps 10% of the population, including some of the most powerful noble families in the kingdom. The growing religious division was made more dangerous by the factional conflicts that had always plagued the French court. Two great noble families, the Guises and the Montmorencys, competed for influence over the king, and their rivalry would soon take on a religious dimension that made it even more bitter. The Guises were fanatical Catholics who saw themselves as defenders of the true faith against Protestant heresy. The Montmorencys were more moderate, and some members of the family, including the constable's nephews, the Châtillon brothers, had converted to Protestantism. Henry II might have managed these tensions had he lived longer, but fate intervened in the most unexpected way. In June 1559, the king organised a great tournament to celebrate the peace of Château Cambrésis and the marriages of his sister and daughter to foreign princes. Henry was an enthusiastic jouster who had participated in countless tournaments throughout his life, and he insisted on taking part despite his age and the concerns of his advisers. On June 30th, 1559, Henry faced Gabriel de Montgomery, the captain of his Scottish Guard, in a joust. The first passes were inconclusive, and Henry demanded another run. This time, Montgomery's lance shattered on impact, and a splinter penetrated the king's visor, entering his eye and lodging in his brain. Henry lingered for 10 days in agony, while the best physicians in Europe, including the famous Vesalius, tried in vain to save him. He died on July 10, 1559, at the age of 40. The death of Henry II was a catastrophe for France. The king left behind 4 sons, but the eldest, Francis, was only 15 years old, sickly, and completely under the influence of his wife's relatives, the Guises. The kingdom was divided by religious conflict, burdened by debt from decades of warfare, and surrounded by enemies who would be quick to exploit any weakness. The stage was set for the bloodiest chapter in French history since the 100 Years' War. Francis II became king at the age of 15, a boy who was in no way prepared for the challenges he would face. He was physically weak, suffering from ailments that may have included tuberculosis, and he was intellectually limited, showing little interest in the business of government. His young wife, Mary Queen of Scots, was far more impressive, beautiful, and accomplished, but she was only 16 herself and had no experience of French politics. Real power passed immediately to the Guise family, the uncles of Mary Queen of Scots. Francis, Duke of Guise, became the dominant military figure in the kingdom, while his brother Charles, Cardinal of Lorraine, controlled the administration and the church. The Guises were determined to use their position to crush Protestantism and advance their family's interests, and they moved quickly to consolidate their hold on power. The Guise ascendancy alarmed many at court, including those who had no sympathy for Protestantism, but who feared the concentration of power in the hands of a single family. The princes of the blood, particularly Antoine of Bourbon, King of Navarre, and his brother Louis, Prince of Condé, believed that they should have a leading role in the government during the king's minority. When they were excluded from power, they began to organise opposition to the Guise regime. The opposition took a dangerous turn in March 1560 with the conspiracy of Amboise. A group of Protestant nobles, with the covert support of Condé, planned to kidnap the young king and remove him from Guy's influence. The plot was discovered before it could be executed, and the conspirators were hunted down and killed. Bodies hung from the walls of the châteaux of Amboise for weeks afterward, a grim warning to any who might challenge the established order. The failure of the Amboise conspiracy only intensified the religious and political tensions in France. The Guises demanded harsh measures against all Protestants whom they blamed for the plot. Moderates, including the Queen Mother Catherine de' Medici, urged caution, fearing that extreme persecution would provoke open rebellion. The debate was cut short by the death of Francis II in December 1560, just 17 months after his accession. Francis died of an ear infection that spread to his brain, a painful end for a young man who had never really had a chance to prove himself. He left no children, and the crown passed to his 10-year-old brother, Charles IX. Mary Queen of Scots, widowed at 18, returned to Scotland to claim her own troubled inheritance, beginning a tragic journey that would end on an English executioner's block 27 years later. The accession of Charles IX brought Catherine de' Medici to the centre of power. As Queen Mother and Regent for her young son, Catherine would dominate French politics for the next 3 decades, navigating the treacherous waters of religious civil war with a combination of cunning, flexibility, and occasional ruthlessness. She has been vilified by historians for centuries, blamed for the worst atrocities of the wars of religion, but she faced challenges that would have overwhelmed most rulers, and she kept the Valois dynasty alive through crises that seemed certain to destroy it. Catherine's initial policy was one of conciliation. She recognised that the Protestants were too numerous and too powerful to be simply crushed, and she hoped that a policy of limited toleration might preserve peace while allowing time for religious passions to cool. The Edict of Saint-Germain in January 1562 granted Huguenots the right to worship outside town walls and to hold synods with royal permission. It was a modest measure by modern standards, but it outraged Catholic hardliners who saw any toleration of heresy as an offence against God. The fragile peace was shattered in March 1562 when the Duke of Guise and his retainers attacked a Huguenot congregation worshipping at Vassy in Champagne. Dozens of Protestants were killed in what became known as the Massacre of Vassy, and the incident ignited the first of the French wars of religion. These conflicts would continue, with brief interruptions, for over 30 years, devastating France and killing hundreds of thousands of people. The wars of religion were not simply religious conflicts, though religion provided the passion and the justification for violence. They were also political struggles, as great noble families competed for power and influence, using religious affiliation as a rallying cry. They were social conflicts, as urban populations turned on neighbours who practiced a different faith. And they were international conflicts, as foreign powers intervened to support their co-religionists and advance their own interests. The First War lasted about a year and ended with the assassination of the Duke of Guise by a Protestant fanatic. The Second War, from 1567 to 1568, saw the Huguenots attempt to kidnap the king in what became known as the Surprise of Meaux. The Third War, from 1568 to 1570, was the bloodiest yet, culminating in the Catholic victory at Jarnac, where the Prince of Condé was murdered after surrendering, and the Huguenot victory at La Roche-l'Abeille. Through all these conflicts, Catherine de' Medici worked tirelessly to find a settlement that would end the bloodshed. She negotiated with both sides, made concessions to the Huguenots that outraged Catholics, and tried to build a party of moderates known as the Politique, who put national unity above religious purity. The Peace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye in 1570 seemed to offer hope for lasting peace, granting the Huguenots significant concessions, including control of several fortified towns as guarantees of their safety. Catherine attempted to cement the peace through a marriage alliance between her daughter Marguerite and Henry of Navarre, the young leader of the Huguenot party. Henry was the son of Antoine of Bourbon and Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre, and he was one of the princes of the blood with a potential claim to the throne should the Valois line fail. A marriage between Henry and Marguerite would unite the two religious factions, and Catherine hoped end the civil wars. The wedding took place in Paris on August 18, 1572, with thousands of Huguenot nobles gathering in the capital to celebrate. What followed was the most infamous event in French history, a massacre that would stain the reputation of the Valois dynasty forever. On August 22nd, an assassin attempted to kill Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the most important Huguenot military leader, wounding him but failing to kill him. The assassination attempt was probably ordered by the Guises, who blamed Coligny for the death of the Duke of Guise 10 years earlier, but some historians have implicated Catherine de' Medici herself. Whoever was responsible, the attempt threw Paris into chaos and created a crisis that would end in catastrophe. The Huguenots were furious and demanded justice. Catherine and Charles IX, fearing a Huguenot uprising, made a fateful decision. Rather than risk being overthrown by Protestant nobles who were already gathered in Paris in large numbers, they would strike first. On the night of August 23-24, 1572, the feast of St. Bartholomew, Catholic forces began a systematic massacre of Huguenots throughout Paris. The killing began with the targeted assassination of Huguenot leaders, including Coligny, who was dragged from his sickbed and murdered. But it quickly spiralled out of control as the Catholic population of Paris turned on their Protestant neighbours. Men, women, and children were hunted through the streets, killed in their homes, thrown from windows, and dumped in the Seine. The violence continued for several days, and when it finally subsided, thousands of Huguenots lay dead in Paris alone. The massacre spread to the provinces as news reached other cities. In Lyons, Toulouse, Bordeaux, and dozens of other towns, local Catholics attacked their Huguenot neighbours with similar ferocity. The total death toll will never be known with certainty, but modern estimates suggest that between 5,000 and 30,000 Protestants were killed across France in the weeks following St. Bartholomew's Day. The St. Bartholomew's Day. A massacre was a watershed moment in European history. Protestant Europe was horrified, and the event became a symbol of Catholic treachery and cruelty that would be invoked for centuries. In France itself, the massacre failed to achieve its goal of destroying the Huguenot movement. Instead, it radicalized the survivors and convinced them that they could never trust the Catholic monarchy. The wars continued with even greater bitterness than before. Charles IX never recovered from the trauma of the massacre. He was haunted by guilt and reportedly suffered from terrible nightmares in which the ghosts of the slain accused him. His health, never robust, declined rapidly, and he died on May 30, 1574, at the age of 23, probably from tuberculosis. On his deathbed, he reportedly told his mother that he blamed her for the massacre and the suffering it had caused. The crown passed to Charles's brother, Henry, who was at that moment in Poland, having been elected King of Poland the previous year. Henry abandoned his Polish throne without hesitation and hurried back to France to claim his inheritance. He became Henry III, the last Valois king of France. Henry III was the most intelligent and cultured of Catherine de' Medici's sons, a man of genuine learning and refined tastes who might have been an excellent king in more peaceful times. But he inherited a kingdom that was tearing itself apart, and he lacked the military skills and the ruthless determination that might have imposed order through force. He was also dogged by rumours about his sexuality, for he surrounded himself with young male favourites called the mignons, whom he showered with gifts and affection. Whether these relationships were sexual or merely expressions of intense friendship remains debated by historians, but they damaged Henry's reputation and provided ammunition for his enemies. The wars of religion continued throughout Henry's reign, growing ever more complex as new factions emerged. The Catholic League, led by Henry, Duke of Guise, the son of the Duke who had been assassinated in 1563, demanded the complete extermination of Protestantism and increasingly challenged royal authority. The Huguenots, led by Henry of Navarre, controlled much of southern and western France and showed no signs of submitting to Catholic rule. And the politiques, moderates who sought peace and national unity, found themselves caught between two extremes that had no interest in compromise. The situation was complicated by the succession question. Henry III had no children, and it became increasingly clear that he would never have any. The heir presumptive to the throne was Henry of Navarre, the Huguenot leader who had barely escaped the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre by converting to Catholicism under duress. Navarre had subsequently returned to Protestantism, and the prospect of a Protestant king was unacceptable to the Catholic League and to many ordinary French Catholics. The crisis came to a head in 1584 when the Duke of Anjou, Henry III's last surviving brother, died of tuberculosis. With his death, the direct Valois line was reduced to the childless king, and Henry of Navarre became the undisputed heir to the throne. The Catholic League responded by forming an alliance with Spain and demanding that Navarre be excluded from the succession in favour of his uncle, the elderly Cardinal of Bourbon. The War of the Three Henrys, as it came to be called, pitted Henry III against Henry of Guise and Henry of Navarre in a three-way struggle for control of France. The king found himself increasingly marginalised, unable to defeat either of his rivals, and forced to make humiliating concessions to the Catholic League. In May 1588, the people of Paris rose in support of Guise, forcing the king to flee his own capital in what became known as the Day of the Barricades. Henry III's response was characteristically devious. Unable to defeat Guise in open conflict, he invited the Duke to a meeting at the Châteaux of Blois in December 1588 and had him assassinated by the royal guard. The Duke's brother, the Cardinal of Guise, was murdered the following day. Catherine de' Medici, who had worked so long to preserve the peace, died just 2 weeks later, perhaps broken by the realization that all her efforts had failed. The assassination of the Guises removed one threat but created others. The Catholic League declared Henry III a tyrant and called for his overthrow. The Pope excommunicated him. Much of France rose in rebellion against royal authority. Henry was forced into an alliance with Henry of Navarre the Protestant claimant he had fought for so long, recognising that only together could they hope to defeat the League. The two Henrys besieged Paris in the summer of 1589, and it seemed that the king might finally triumph over his enemies. But on August 1st, 1589, a young Dominican friar named Jacques Clément gained access to the royal camp by claiming to have secret information for the king. When Henry granted him a private audience, Clément stabbed him in the abdomen with a concealed knife. The king's guards killed the assassin immediately, but the wound was mortal. Henry III died the following day, the third French king to be assassinated in less than 30 years. With Henry's death, the House of Valois came to an end after 261 years. The crown passed, at least in theory, to Henry of Navarre, who became Henry IV and founded the Bourbon dynasty that would rule France until the Revolution. But Henry's path to the throne was far from clear. He was a Protestant in a Catholic country, and it would take another 9 years of war before he could secure his position. His famous declaration that Paris is worth a mass, explaining his conversion to Catholicism in 1593, marked the pragmatic compromise that finally brought peace to France. The Valois dynasty left behind a complex legacy. They had inherited a kingdom devastated by war and plague, and had, through centuries of struggle, transformed it into the most powerful nation in Europe. They had survived the 100 Years' War, recovered from the English conquests, and built a centralised state that would serve as a model for other European monarchies. They had patronised the arts and learning, making France a centre of Renaissance culture that rivalled Italy itself. But they had also presided over the bloodiest religious conflicts in French history. Conflicts that killed hundreds of thousands and left scars that would take generations to heal. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre remained a source of shame and controversy for centuries, and the wars of religion demonstrated the terrible consequences of allowing religious passion to override political wisdom.